Imagine being dressed in 12 layers of silk so tight you can barely breathe. Your hair pinned with ornaments that cost more than a year's wages. Every smile, every gesture choreographed to perfection. You are an oiran, the most celebrated courtesan in Edo's pleasure quarters. But one morning, you notice your body has changed. A secret that, if discovered, could cost you everything. What happens when the women who were trained to be fantasy itself are forced to face a reality they were never supposed to have? How do you hide a pregnancy when your every move is watched, your body owned by a brothel, your future measured in coins? Tonight on Little Historical, we step behind the silk screens to uncover the desperate, dangerous, and often heartbreaking ways Japanese courtesans dealt with unwanted pregnancies. If stories like this speak to you, take a moment to like and subscribe. Now let's walk into the shadows together. To understand why pregnancy was the most feared secret in the pleasure quarters, you must first understand the cage in which these women lived. The Yoshiwara district was a world built on illusion, lantern light flickering against paper screens, the scent of incense masking the smell of desperation, and women who moved like poetry given flesh. But beneath the silk and the painted smiles, there was no freedom. A courtesan did not own her body. It was owned by the brothel, her every breath measured in debt. She was trained from childhood to entertain, to seduce, to become the fantasy that wealthy merchants and samurai paid to lose themselves in. Yet fantasy has no room for reality. And pregnancy was the most dangerous reality of all. Imagine waking each day knowing that one small sign, a wave of nausea, a late cycle, a subtle swelling beneath your obi, could unravel everything. There were no whispered congratulations, no quiet understanding. Only the cold calculus of the brothel owner, who saw in a growing belly not a life, but a liability. A pregnant courtesan could not work, could not flatter, could not perform the rituals of desire that kept the money flowing. She became a broken instrument, a costly inconvenience. And so the moment a woman suspected she carried a child, a silent clock began to tick. She could not tell her lover, the man who had visited her night after night, who had whispered promises he never intended to keep. He would vanish the moment reality intruded. She could not confide in her sisters, for loyalty was fragile in a place where secrets were currency. She was utterly alone with a truth that could destroy her. This was the forbidden reality, that the same body celebrated as art was now a crime scene in waiting. To be discovered was to face demotion to the lowest ranks, to serve the roughest clients, to be locked away until the problem resolved itself. Some women were simply cast out onto the streets, their contracts torn, their futures erased. Others vanished entirely, their fates known only to the dark waters that bordered the district. So they learned to read their bodies like enemies, to smile through cramps, to tighten their sashes until they could barely breathe. Every performance became a double act, one face for the client, and beneath it, a mask of terror. For in the pleasure quarters, the greatest sin was not love, nor betrayal, but simply becoming a mother. And that sin demanded a price measured in blood, secrecy, and silence. Which is why so many turned to darker solutions, remedies whispered from trembling lips, teas brewed in stolen hours, and the hands of women who worked not by lantern light, but in the shadows where no one would see. So they turned to the only allies they had, plants that promised what no doctor would dare speak aloud. In the stolen hours between sunset and the first lantern lighting, women whispered recipes passed down not from healers but from survivors, recipes measured not in cups but in desperation. The leaves of mugwort, called yomagi, were steeped until the water turned the color of bitter earth. Safflower petals, prized for the crimson dye they gave to fine silks, were boiled into a tea that promised to purge what could not be kept. And licorice root, so sweet on the tongue when used sparingly, became a poison when taken in the quantities these women consumed, enough to make the womb clench, to force the body to expel its secret in a flood of blood and cramping. These were not gentle remedies. They were weapons turned inward. A courtesan would brew her tea in a chipped pot hidden beneath her sleeping mat, drinking it in the dark while her roommates breathed softly nearby. She would swallow the bitterness and wait, for the pain to begin, for the bleeding to start, for the hope that by morning her body would once again belong only to the brothel. But the line between cure and death was terrifyingly thin. Too little and nothing happened. Too much and she might never rise from her futon again. Some women convulsed, their fevers rising until delirium took them. Others hemorrhaged in silence, staining the floorboards that would be scrubbed clean before dawn. And still they drank, because the alternative was far worse. The recipes varied from district to district, each brothel holding its own whispered code. Add ginger if you want it to act faster. Don't use too much safflower or your skin will burn. 3 leaves for a small problem, 5 for a larger one, but never 7, because 7 was what the old women used when they no longer cared if you survived. It was a desperate science, part folklore, part gamble, practiced by women who had no other choices. And all of it had to be done while maintaining the illusion of grace. A courtesan could not afford to show weakness. She still had to forsake, still had to laugh at a client's dull jokes, still had to let him believe she was made of silk and nothing more. So she learned to smile through the cramps, to steady her trembling hands, to blame her pallor on the change of seasons. And when the tea failed, as it so often did, she was left with only darker options, ones that required leaving the brothel in the dead of night to find the women who operated not with herbs, but with crude instruments and whispered promises of silence. When the bitter tea failed and the bleeding would not come, a courtesan faced the most dangerous journey of her life. In the darkness, long after the lanterns of Yoshiwara had burned low, she would slip out through a service gate, her silk robes exchanged for plain cotton, her elaborate hair unpinned and hidden beneath a hood. She walked not toward the temple or the tea house, but toward the shadowed edges of the district, where the streets narrowed and respectable folk did not go. There, she sought a woman known only by whispered name, a beso, a retired midwife who had once been a courtesan herself, now trading in the only skill her ruined body still possessed. These women operated in secret rooms behind shuttered windows, their doors marked by nothing but a folded cloth or a candle left burning too late. You did not find them. You heard about them from a trembling friend, a note tucked into a sleeve, a name exchanged in the space between breaths. The cost was always high. Some took coins, others silk sashes or hairpins that had once been gifts from wealthy patrons. One old woman was said to accept nothing but the gold lacquer combs that courtesans wore on their most important nights, collecting them like trophies from the desperate. Inside, there was no comfort, no kindness, only the cold efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that mercy was a luxury no one in this world could afford. The tools were crude, metal implements heated over candle flames, cloths torn into strips, jars of murky liquid that smelled of vinegar and something older. There was no anesthesia, no apology, no promise that the woman who entered would leave the same as she came. Some died on the stained floor, their bodies carried out before dawn, their absence explained as fever or flight. Others survived but never bore children again, their wombs scarred beyond repair, a fate that, in the twisted logic of the pleasure quarters, was sometimes considered a blessing. The risk extended beyond the procedure itself. If a courtesan was caught seeking out such services, if the brothel discovered what she had done, the punishment was swift and brutal. Demotion to the lowest rank, forced labor, or being sold to a lesser house where the clients were rougher and the walls thinner. And yet they came anyway, night after night, because the alternative was a secret that grew heavier with each passing week. They placed their lives in the hands of women who were ghosts themselves, women who asked no questions and told no lies, whose only currency was silence bought with blood. For those who survived, there was no relief, only the slow return to the brothel floor, the painted smile fixed back in place, and the knowledge that the next time, if there was a next time, there might be no one left to call. For those who survived, there was no relief, only the slow return to the brothel floor, the painted smile fixed back in place, and the knowledge that the next time, if there was a next time, there might be no one left to call. But for some women, the tea and the midwife both failed, and the secret grew too large to hide beneath silk and binding. Then came the moment that no whispered recipe could prevent, the birth itself, forced into the shadows like a crime. It happened in storage rooms behind stack crates, in the narrow space between a sleeping mat and a paper wall, sometimes outdoors beneath the bare branches of a winter tree where no one would hear. A trusted friend might be summoned, a servant who owed a favor, someone who knew how to boil water without asking questions. But more often than not, the courtesan labored alone, biting into a folded cloth to keep her screams from drifting through the thin walls. She had learned to endure pain in silence, and now that silence became the only midwife she could trust. When the child drew its first breath, there was no cry of joy, no celebration, only the frantic work of cutting the cord with whatever was at hand and wrapping the tiny body in a scrap of fabric. Some women held their babies for a few desperate moments, pressing their lips to a forehead they would never kiss again. Others could not bear to look, ordering the child taken away before dawn. The infants who survived were often left at the edge of the district, on the steps of a small shrine, beneath the eaves of a temple, in a basket placed where someone might find them before the cold did. There were places built for this quiet tragedy, known to every woman in the pleasure quarters but never spoken of aloud. Statues of Jizo, the guardian of lost children, stood worn and weathered, their stone faces softened by moss and years of rain. Around their necks, Women tied tiny red bibs, offerings left not for the gods but for the souls of the children they could not keep. These children were called Mizuko, water children, souls who drifted between worlds, neither fully born nor fully passed on. And the women who left them never forgot. They returned when they could, in secret, placing small toys or folded paper prayers beside the statues, whispering names they had never been allowed to speak. It was the only motherhood the pleasure quarters permitted, a grief expressed in silence, a love that could only be offered in the dark. Some came back for years, their fingers tracing the same stone features, their prayers unchanged. Others never returned at all, too haunted by what they had done. But all of them carried the weight of those tiny lives beneath their silk, long after their bodies had healed and their contracts had expired. And in the quiet corners of Yoshiwara, when the lanterns flickered and the laughter of clients faded, you could still hear the echo of that weight, a secret carried not in the womb, but in the soul.